Hey Reddit, I don't usually post personal stuff like this, but lately I've been reflecting on my past a lot. There's so much to unpack, so this might be a long one. Even though some details are fuzzy, certain moments are crystal clear. No matter how many years have passed, I was 6 years old when my life took a turn I never saw coming. My name's Alex, and back then, my parents, Claire and Tom, told me I'd be visiting my grandparents for a while. I was excited because Grandma Nancy always had fresh-baked cookies ready and let me watch cartoons way past my bedtime. Grandpa Harold loved to take me into the garden to pick tomatoes. I didn't even like tomatoes, but I liked spending time with him. When my parents said I'd be staying there for a little while, I didn't think anything of it. Looking back, there were signs. My mom was unusually quiet that morning. She hugged me tightly, but the warmth I usually felt was missing. It was stiff, like she was holding back something. My dad was rushing around, barely making eye contact, as if he couldn't wait to get out of there. When he dropped me off, he didn't even come inside the house. He just waved from the car and drove off. At the time, I thought he was just in a hurry. Kids don't notice the bigger picture, they see what's right in front of them. I didn't realize then that they were leaving me behind. For the first few days, I kept asking Grandma Nancy when my parents were coming back. She'd smile and say, "Soon, sweetheart." I think she believed it too, but days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Eventually, Grandma stopped giving me answers. She just looked sad every time I asked. Grandpa Harold, who was always so cheerful, started shaking his head and muttering whenever my parents came up. The real explanation came from my Uncle Ben. He's my dad's younger brother, the type who never sugarcoats anything. One afternoon, while I was playing on the swings, he sat down next to me and said, as gently as he could, that my parents weren't coming back. "Not for a while anyway," he added. "They think it's best for you to stay here." I couldn't understand. Why was it best for me to stay away from them? Why weren't they coming back? Uncle Ben tried to explain that my sister, Mia, was sick and needed their full attention. Even at 6, that explanation didn't sit right with me. Why couldn't they care for both of us? Why couldn't I be there too? Uncle Ben didn't have answers, and I could tell he was angry at them even if he didn't say it out loud. That night, I cried harder than I ever had before. Grandma Nancy held me on the couch and rocked me back and forth, just letting me sob until I was exhausted. I think that's when it finally sunk in. They weren't coming back for me. Life with Grandma Nancy and Grandpa Harold wasn't bad. They loved me, and they did their best to give me a stable life, but they were getting older, and having a young child to care for was hard on them. That's when Uncle Ben and his wife, Aunt Jess, stepped up. At first, Uncle Ben would visit regularly, helping with chores around the house, mowing the lawn, and taking me for ice cream when he noticed I needed cheering up. But as time went on, it became clear that my grandparents couldn't keep up with my needs full-time. One evening, they sat me down and explained that I'd be moving in with Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess. I didn't want to leave Grandma Nancy and Grandpa Harold. The thought of leaving them felt like losing another piece of my already shattered world. But Grandma promised, "You'll still see us all the time." And she was right. They lived just a few blocks away from Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess, so I got to visit often. Moving in with Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess was a big adjustment. I was used to the slower pace of my grandparents' home. Suddenly, I was living with younger adults who had more energy and different rules. Bedtimes were strictly enforced, and routines were set, but they also brought a kind of joy and enthusiasm that I hadn't experienced in a while. Uncle Ben played catch with me in the yard, and Aunt Jess baked cookies and let me decorate them, even though I was terrible at it. Slowly, their home started to feel like mine. One night, when I was 8, I called Aunt Jess Mom without even thinking about it. She smiled and hugged me, saying, "You can call us whatever you want, Alex." But from that moment, it felt right. They were the ones raising me, tucking me in and cheering me on. My biological parents? They were ghosts. I tried calling them sometimes, but they never picked up. I sent letters with little updates, things like, "I got a gold star on my spelling test," or "We're learning about dinosaurs." But they never wrote back. When I was around 9, they finally visited. I don't even remember why. Maybe they felt guilty or just wanted to check a box. It was awkward. They didn't know how to talk to me, and I didn't know what to say to them. They felt like strangers. My dad asked generic questions like, "How's school?" And my mom brought me a toy truck I didn't care about. After they left, Uncle Ben hugged me and said, "You don't have to worry about them. We've got you." That's when I knew. Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess were my real parents. After that awkward visit, something inside me shifted. I was done waiting for my biological parents to care. I stopped asking about them as much and stopped hoping for phone calls or letters. I didn't stop caring entirely. They were still my parents, after all. But I realized asking about them only led to silence or sadness. By the time I was 10, life with Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess had settled into something steady and familiar. They treated me like their own, and while I didn't say it out loud, I thought of them as Mom and Dad. They went to every parent-teacher conference, even the boring ones where my teachers just said I was doing fine. Aunt Jess stayed up late with me when I procrastinated on school projects, even though she had work in the morning. They never made me feel like a burden. One summer, they even took me to Disneyland. I didn't realize it then, but they'd saved for months to make that trip happen. We weren't rich, but they wanted me to have those experiences. Uncle Ben rode Space Mountain with me, even though he hated roller coasters. I remember him laughing and pretending to be brave, just for me. Meanwhile, my biological parents faded further into the background. They were like shadows, memories that grew fainter with time. Occasionally, Grandma Nancy would mention them. "Your mom asked how you were doing," she'd say, her voice soft and hesitant, but it never felt real. If they cared, why didn't they ask me directly? Why didn't they pick up the phone or write back? When I was 11, they visited again. I didn't know why they kept showing up when they clearly didn't know how to be parents. This time, I didn't get my hopes up. I didn't clean my room or brush my hair extra carefully. When they arrived, my mom smiled awkwardly and handed me a toy truck, another generic gift like she barely knew me. My dad's questions felt forced. "So, how's school?" he asked, as if that made up for years of absence. I felt anger bubbling up. "I'm your son. Why don't you know me?" But instead of yelling, I just gave short answers until they left. When they were gone, I told Uncle Ben I didn't want to see them anymore. He didn't push me. "That's your choice, buddy," he said. "We'll support you no matter what." And that was that. I stopped calling and stopped writing. The silence between us felt mutual. If they didn't want to fight for me, I wouldn't fight for them either. By the time I was 12, I'd made up my mind. I was done. No more reaching out, no more waiting by the mailbox, hoping for a letter that would never come. My real parents were right in front of me, Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess. They showed up for me every day, in ways my biological parents never did. I still saw Grandma Nancy and Grandpa Harold often. They were a comforting presence, always reminding me I was loved. But even they seemed resigned to the fact that my parents had checked out. When I asked Grandma once if my parents might come back for me, she just smiled sadly and said, "Sweetheart, they know where to find you if they want to." That hit me hard. They could find me anytime, but they chose not to. The sense of being disposable haunted me sometimes. If my own parents could abandon me so easily, what did that say about me? Was I not worth fighting for? I didn't talk about those feelings much, but Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess must have sensed them. One evening, out of the blue, Uncle Ben sat me down and said, "You know you're wanted, right? You're not here because we had to take you in. We wanted you." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I didn't cry in front of him, but later that night I did. That's when I stopped thinking of myself as the kid who got left behind. Instead, I was the kid they chose, and that made all the difference. By the time I was 14, my life with Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess felt normal. They were my family. We had routines, traditions, and inside jokes. Aunt Jess made the best pancakes every Saturday morning, and Uncle Ben taught me how to change a tire and grill burgers in the backyard. They never made me feel like a burden. If anything, they made me feel like I was the best thing that ever happened to them. One evening, I overheard Aunt Jess talking to Grandma Nancy. She sounded sad. "We tried everything, but it just wasn't meant to be," she said softly. I realized then that they'd never been able to have kids of their own. They never told me because they didn't want me to feel like a replacement. Knowing that made me appreciate them even more. They hadn't just stepped up out of obligation, they genuinely wanted to be parents. And they chose me. Around that time, we started talking about adoption. Uncle Ben brought it up casually over dinner. "How would you feel if we made this official?" he asked. At first, I didn't know what to say. They already felt like my parents. Did a piece of paper really matter? But the more we talked, the more I realized it did. It wasn't just about legality. It was about belonging. It was about the world recognizing what we already knew. We were family. It wasn't a simple process. My biological parents still had parental rights, even though they hadn't been around for years. Uncle Ben explained it would be expensive and complicated, but they were willing to go through it if I wanted to. I told them I'd think about it. I talked to Grandma Nancy about it, and she said something that stuck with me. "You already know where your heart belongs, sweetheart. This is just catching the rest of the world up." A few months later, I told Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess I wanted to go forward with the adoption. That decision kicked off a long, frustrating process filled with court dates, paperwork, and legal hurdles. My biological parents didn't fight it. They probably didn't care enough to, but the system still made it harder than it needed to be. Through it all, Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess never wavered. They wanted me to know, without a doubt, that I was theirs. The adoption process dragged on longer than any of us expected. Lawyers, court hearings, stacks of paperwork. It felt like a never-ending maze. Even though my biological parents didn't contest it, the system still took its time. Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess handled it all with patience, even when I felt frustrated. They never made me feel like it was a hassle or that I wasn't worth the effort. If anything, they seemed more determined with every new obstacle. I was 15 when the adoption finally went through. I remember standing in the courthouse, feeling like the air was heavier than usual. The judge looked at us and said the words I'd been waiting to hear. "From this day forward, you are legally recognized as the child of Benjamin and Jessica Parker." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Uncle Ben hugged me tight, and I could feel his chest rise and fall, like he was holding back tears. Aunt Jess wiped her eyes and whispered, "We've always been your family, but now the world knows it too." That night, we celebrated in the simplest, most perfect way. Uncle Ben picked up pizzas from my favorite place, and Aunt Jess made brownies. We ate in the living room, laughing, talking, and just being together. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like home, because it was home. From that day on, everything felt a little different, even if not much had changed on the surface. The adoption didn't suddenly make us closer because we were already close, but it erased that shadow of doubt I'd carried for years. I belonged to them, and they belonged to me. No one could take that away now. After the adoption, I stopped thinking of my biological parents as my real parents. They were just two people I used to know. People who made choices that hurt me, then disappeared. I wasn't angry at them anymore. Not exactly. I just didn't care. Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess were the ones who mattered. It felt good to let go of the hurt, like dropping a heavy load I'd been carrying on my back for too long. I had my family, people who chose me, fought for me, and showed up every day. That was all I needed. High school passed by in a blur of late-night study sessions, football games, and weekends spent with my family. Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess came to every event, big or small. Whether it was a science fair or a lousy homecoming game where we lost by 20 points, they were always there. Their faces were the ones I searched for in the crowd, and their cheers were the ones I listened for. On my 16th birthday, we had a small party at home. Grandma Nancy and Grandpa Harold came over, and Aunt Jess made my favorite chocolate cake. Uncle Ben handed me a small box. Inside was a silver chain with a pendant shaped like a feather. "This is a symbol of freedom, Alex," he said. "Freedom to write your own story, to choose your own path." I clutched the pendant tightly. It felt like more than a gift. It felt like a reminder of how far we'd come. Later that night, after everyone left, Uncle Ben and I sat on the back porch. The night air was cool and the sky was full of stars. We didn't say much, just watched the sky in comfortable silence. Then, Uncle Ben broke the stillness. "You know, Alex, you're stronger than you think," he said. "I know the past hasn't been easy, but you've made it through." I nodded, not knowing how to respond. He didn't need me to say anything. He just wanted me to know he was proud of me. Around this time, Grandma Nancy started getting sick. She never let on how bad it was, always waving off our concerns with a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she'd say, even when she wasn't. But we all knew. Grandpa Harold had passed a couple of years earlier, and now Grandma seemed smaller, like the light inside her was fading. I spent as much time with her as I could. We'd sit together on her porch, drinking lemonade and talking about everything and nothing. She told me stories about her childhood, her adventures with Grandpa, and even little things about my parents when they were kids. Sometimes she'd mention my sister Mia, and her eyes would get that faraway look, as if she was seeing memories only she could see. One day, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, she took my hand. Her grip was weaker than it used to be, but her gaze was steady. "Alex, no matter what happens, you've got people who love you. Remember that," she said. "Love is what makes a family, not blood." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I know, Grandma." A few weeks later, she passed away quietly in her sleep. It hurt more than I expected. Losing her felt like losing a piece of my history, a piece of the foundation that held me up when everything else fell apart. Aunt Jess and Uncle Ben held me through the grief, reminding me that even though Grandma was gone, her love would always stay with me. After the funeral, I found myself thinking about my sister, Mia. I hadn't seen her in years, and even though I didn't blame her for what happened, there was a hollow place inside me where our relationship should have been. I wondered if she ever thought about me, if she ever wished things had been different. But those thoughts felt like whispers from another life, a life that no longer belonged to me. I was 17 when I got the news that Mia had passed away. It was late November, just after Thanksgiving. Grandma's church friend called to let us know. My heart clenched, but I didn't cry. How do you grieve for someone who feels more like a memory than a person? Aunt Jess held my hand, her eyes full of sorrow. "It's okay to feel whatever you need to feel," she said softly. I nodded, but I didn't know what I felt. Loss, maybe. Regret for the relationship we never got to have. A sense of emptiness that didn't quite know where to settle. The funeral was in 2 weeks. I wrestled with the decision to go. I didn't want to see my biological parents. I didn't want to open old wounds. But Mia didn't deserve to be ignored. In the end, I decided to go. Not for my parents, but for her. The morning of Mia's funeral felt cold, even though the sun was shining. My breath hung in the air as I stood in front of the mirror, trying to smooth down my hair. Aunt Jess adjusted my collar, her fingers lingering just a moment longer than usual. "You don't have to do this if you don't want to," she said softly. "I know," I replied, "but I think I need to." Uncle Ben drove me to the church. The ride was quiet, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the crunch of tires on gravel. My thoughts twisted into knots. I wasn't sure what I'd feel when I got there. I wasn't even sure if I'd feel anything. Grief, anger, regret. It all swirled inside me, restless and unsettled. When we arrived, I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The church looked smaller than I remembered, worn by time and memories. I slipped inside quietly, taking a seat in the back row. I didn't want anyone to notice me, especially not my biological parents. The service started, and the room filled with whispers and the scent of lilies. My eyes were drawn to the front where my parents sat. My mom, Claire, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. My dad, Tom, stared straight ahead, his face pale and hollow. They looked older, weighed down by years of worry and loss. But when I looked at them, I felt nothing, just an empty space where love should have been. The pastor spoke about Mia's strength, how she fought her illness with everything she had. He talked about her kindness, her laughter, the light she brought to the people who knew her. I listened, trying to find my sister in those words, trying to remember the little girl who used to braid my hair and scold me for breaking her toys. Those memories were so distant now, like faded photographs in a dusty album. When the service ended, I stood to leave. I didn't want to linger, didn't want to get drawn into awkward conversations or false apologies. But before I could slip out the door, I felt a hand on my shoulder. "Alex," a voice said softly. I turned around and saw my mom's eyes, red-rimmed and searching. Her face was a mask of sadness and hope, like she was clinging to something fragile. "Hi, sweetheart," she whispered, like we were picking up a conversation that had never started. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then the words came out before I could stop them. "Sorry, do I know you?" Her face crumpled. I saw the shock and pain in her eyes, but I didn't care. I was done pretending everything was okay, done letting them back in just because they felt guilty now. My dad stepped forward. "Where are your parents?" he said, his voice breaking. I shook my head. "My parents are at home," I said quietly. "The people who raised me, who stayed?" I turned to leave, my legs shaking. My mom's voice called after me, pleading, desperate. "Please, Alex, we just want to talk." I stopped for a moment, my back still turned. "You had years to talk," I said. "You chose silence." I walked out of the church, the weight of my words hanging in the air. Outside, the cold air hit my face, sharp and bracing. Uncle Ben was waiting by the car, his eyes soft with understanding. He didn't say anything, just opened his arms. I walked into his embrace, the tears I'd been holding back finally spilling over. That night, I couldn't sleep. The confrontation replayed in my mind, over and over. I kept wondering if I'd been too harsh, if maybe I should have listened to what they had to say. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered the years of silence, the missed birthdays, the unanswered letters. A few days later, a letter arrived. Aunt Jess handed it to me carefully, like it might explode. "It's from them," she said. "You don't have to read it." But I did. Curiosity, anger, maybe even a sliver of hope. I had to know what they wanted to say. The letter was long, pages of apologies and explanations. My mom's handwriting was neat, but her words felt tangled and messy. She talked about how overwhelmed they'd been when Mia got sick, how they thought sending me away was the best way to protect me. She wrote about the guilt they carried, the regret that had eaten away at them for years. They asked for forgiveness, for a chance to start over now that Mia was gone. The last line stung the most. "No matter what you say or do, you'll always be our son." I stared at the words until they blurred. They sounded like the truth, but truth was tricky. They might have been my parents by blood, but blood didn't raise me. Blood didn't wipe my tears, tuck me in, or cheer for me at every school event. I showed the letter to Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess. Uncle Ben read it with a clenched jaw, his fingers gripping the paper like it might slip away. When he finished, he said, "It's your call, kiddo. Whatever you decide, we're here for you." Grandma Nancy had a different take when I told her. She shook her head slowly. "They made their bed, Alex. Now they want to unmake it because it's uncomfortable. Don't let them guilt you into anything you're not ready for." I didn't know what I was ready for. The letter left me feeling torn, like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, not sure if I should jump or turn back. I carried the letter with me for weeks, reading it over and over. I thought about what it would mean to let them back into my life. Would it heal the wounds, or just rip them open again? Could we ever rebuild something real, or was it too late? Finally, I wrote back. It wasn't long, just a couple of paragraphs. I told them I appreciated their apology, but I wasn't ready to forgive. I needed more time. I promised I'd reach out if I was ever ready. I didn't call them Mom or Dad. I just signed my name. When I mailed the letter, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief because I'd finally said what I needed to say. Sadness because I knew it wasn't the reunion they were hoping for. A week later, another letter arrived. My mom's handwriting again, but this one was shorter. She wrote that she understood and would wait as long as it took. No guilt, no pleading, just a quiet acknowledgement of my boundaries. For now, that was enough. Life settled back into its rhythm after that last letter. The snow melted, spring rolled in, and I focused on the things that grounded me: school, my friends, and my family. The family that had always been there. Uncle Ben and Aunt Jess, now just Mom and Dad in my heart and mind, kept showing up like they always did. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was everyday love, solid and constant. I didn't think much about my biological parents after that. They were like distant clouds on the horizon, present, but far enough away that they couldn't cast shadows over my days. Every now and then, a memory would bubble up, but it didn't sting the way it used to. It was like the wound had finally scabbed over. By the time I was 18, I had one foot out the door, ready for college. My parents helped me pack up my things, stuffing boxes with clothes, books, and bits of my childhood. Aunt Jess, Mom, tucked cookies into my bag like she always did. Uncle Ben, Dad, gave me advice about keeping my car running and staying safe on late-night walks back from the library. When we pulled up to the college dorm, it hit me all at once. I was leaving home, leaving the safety of the people who chose me when others didn't. My throat tightened as I unloaded the boxes. My mom tried to hold it together, but I could see her eyes glistening. My dad gave me one of his steady, reassuring pats on the back. "You've got this, kid," he said. That night, after they left, I sat in my new room staring at the ceiling. The quiet was different here, the shadows unfamiliar, but I felt a kind of peace deep inside. I wasn't that lost little boy anymore. I wasn't waiting for anyone to come back. I was building my own life now, with a foundation that was strong and steady. Holidays brought me back home. When I walked through the door, it was like slipping into my favorite old sweater. Warm, familiar. My mom would be in the kitchen, humming to herself, and my dad would ask me about every little thing I learned at school. Grandma Nancy's absence was still felt, like a missing piece of a puzzle, but her love lingered in every corner of that home. I didn't hear much from my biological parents after that last letter. Sometimes I'd wonder if they ever thought of me, if they were out there trying to piece together the fragments of their own lives, but those thoughts didn't haunt me. They were just passing clouds, easily brushed aside. When I was 20, I got a call from one of Grandma Nancy's old church friends. My biological father had passed away. Heart failure. The news landed softly, like a leaf settling on the ground. I felt nothing. No anger, no grief, just an empty kind of acknowledgement, like hearing about the death of a distant relative you'd never really known. I didn't go to the funeral. I didn't see a point in it. My mom and dad, the ones who mattered, understood. They didn't push me. They just stood by me, like they always had. A few weeks later, I received one final letter from my biological mother. It was short, just a few lines. She said she hoped I was happy, that she understood if I never wanted to see her again, that she loved me, in her own way, and she was sorry for everything. I held the letter for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. I just felt peaceful, like a chapter was finally closing. I put the letter away in a drawer, not out of bitterness, but because I didn't need it to define me. It was just another part of the story that shaped who I was. Time moved forward, as it always does. I graduated college and started my first real job. My parents were there, cheering me on every step of the way. They were the ones I called when I was stressed or overwhelmed. They were the ones I visited when I needed comfort or a reminder of who I was. One summer afternoon, I sat with my dad on the back porch, the air thick with the scent of freshly cut grass. We watched the sunset in silence. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "You know, Alex, we're proud of you. Not just for what you've done, but for who you are." I swallowed hard, my chest tight. "Thanks, Dad," I said. "I'm proud of you too." The words felt simple, but they carried a weight I knew he understood. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the edges. And we sat there, two people who'd chosen each other, bound by love, that had nothing to do with blood. Now, when I think about family, I don't think about the people who left. I think about the ones who stayed, the ones who showed up, who kept showing up, even when things were hard. Family isn't about who shares your DNA. It's about who shares your life, who stands by you, and who loves you without conditions. My parents, Ben and Jess, are my real family. They taught me that love is a choice you make every single day. They chose me, and I chose them right back. That's the only story that matters.